Hello everyone, this is Peter Svidler for Chess24 with my recap of the game of the day of the first round of Altibox Norway Chess 2017, the strongest tournament of the year, most likely in terms of average rating and quality of field. Those two things are very, very connected, obviously. And a long-awaited event with most of the top 10 playing. And in the first round, as you can more or less expect with a field which is this strong and this close, there were a lot of fairly correctly played games which generally result in draws, but not all the games were drawn. And the game we chose for the game of the day is a game between Hikaru Nakamura with white, playing against Nakamura-Giri with black. Hikaru, obviously a very strong blitz player, after a somewhat shaky start, finished in the top half, securing himself 5 whites and 4 blacks in the classical tournament. And Anish had a fairly disastrous blitz tournament, scoring only a point and a half out of 9, which is nowhere near his actual blitz playing strength. And you always hesitate to read too much into results of blitz tournaments, in particular blitz tournaments in which only the color composition, so to speak, is being determined. But it was probably an indication that Anish is not as warmed up for this tournament as he maybe wished to be. And with that introduction, I think it's time to go to the game. So there we go. Hikaru white against Anish with the black pieces, and Hikaru starts with d4. Most players at the top these days are fairly ambidextrous, but Hikaru, I think, is more of a d4 player than e4 player these days. And Anish, I'm not sure whether this was a surprise or not, but Anish goes for the Grunfeld, which is an opening obviously very dear to my heart. Recently, Hikaru against me in the FIDE Grand Prix, and also during the Blitz tournament in Stavanger and during the Zurich tournament in April, Hikaru played knight of 3, bishop g7, e3, a reasonably well-known these days sideline against the Grunfeld, but the one that shouldn't really give white very much if black is careful. And against Anish, he switches to a much more concrete and a much more aggressive weapon against the Grunfeld, namely 4 bishop g5, to which Anish replied with knight e4. There's a number of options already available to black on move 4. I recommend in my video series the move bishop g7, and in this position most people these days play c5, and they do it with generally very decent results. There's also the move c6, which I recommended in the videos. It's still very playable, but c5 these days is the height of fashion, and there's a number of very high-profile games starting from this position. But the old knight e4 has never really disappeared, and this is what Anish goes for. Bishop h4 is by far the most critical move here. Bishop f4 is a lot easier to handle. Takes bc4, bc3, d takes c4, I'm sorry. And this is the starting position, in particular the position after e3, bishop e6. This is the starting position of a number of high-profile games, but this line, apart from the efforts of, I think, in particular Evgeny Tomashevsky with white, it sort of gave way. First of all, I think maybe because black started playing bishop g7 a lot more, but also because I think in this position, there were very few people who were willing to enter the very difficult to comprehend complications which arise in the main line. MVL with black and Tomashevsky with white maybe being the two people who are still ready to play this. And they played a number of very interesting games starting from bishop e2. I think the current correct move order is knight d7, knight f3, bishop g7, castles, queen c2, and this line requires a lot of work from both sides, and the game in particular, let's say between Tomashevsky and MVL, they played a number of them, but the one they played very recently in the Moscow Grand Prix is very interesting and was, I think, should be studied by anyone who is interested in what's going on in this line of the Grunfeld. But Hikaru, instead of all that, played Queen b1, which is an old move and not as popular as Bishop e2 these days, but a very viable alternative to it. And Anish replied to it with b6, which looks like the most obvious move in the world, but there is a very valid alternative to b6 here, namely c5, a move which I can proudly say I invented over the board in my game against Vasily Ivanchuk in, I think, Morelia in 06 probably. I was at that point feeling the effects of jet lag, and also a couple of days previously I lost a somewhat unpleasant game to Levon Aronin in the same line, and when Vasily decided to repeat it, I thought, okay, let's play something new, and I came up with the idea of c5, queen takes b7, bishop d5, and after queen b5, this being my creation over the board, I went slightly astray. I played knight d7, a move which doesn't exactly lose, but it's not the best move in the position, and people have since refined it by playing queen d7. And yeah, this position is very, very playable for black. If white takes the pawn on c5, black gets a lot of counterplay with all the tempi black gets chasing this queen around. And for only one pawn, black gets tremendous compensation here and very nice active play. So I'm not exactly sure what Hikaru's plan was after c5, and we will never know, because Anish played b6. And here, a somewhat interesting move, knight h3. Which is one way white can use the fact that the knight is still on g1 and has all the options open to him, because in general, in order to win back the c4 pawn, you need to shift the bishop from e6, or perhaps trade it. And normally white is doing that by going knight f3 and then knight g5. But by playing knight h3, white has this option of creating not only the idea of knight g5, but also the idea of knight f4. Which makes it somewhat harder for black to prevent white from reaching this bishop on e6. Bishop h6 is a fairly normal answer to this. You can take on h3, but after, I mean, there is an intermediate move queen e4, which is interesting, but also after the simple gh3, most likely the pawn on c4 will fall, and the spoiled structure on the king side will be very amply compensated by the bishop, which will eventually land on g3, cementing the king position and also creating a lot of pressure against the black queen side in all the positions you are likely eventually to get from here. The bishop h6 though covers both g5 and f4. If white still goes knight g5, you can just take and make, I don't know, probably queen d5 is a decent move here. And black will most likely be, I mean, there will be some positional compensation for the pawn, but it's quite clear that the pawn on c4 is very unlikely to be recaptured. In view of that, white goes bishop g5, and here bishop g7 is possible, but after knight f4, black probably will have to part with the c4 pawn anyway, and Danish went for a more practical decision. He took on g5, knight takes g5, and played queen d5. If you go bishop d5 instead, white can of course play e4, bishop b7, queen takes c4, castles, and there's a number of moves here available to white. Queen d3 is one of them. You could also maybe make an argument for something like h4 if you feel adventurous. Instead, Anish played queen d5, knight takes e6, and here he actually spent a decent amount of time choosing between queen takes e6 and f takes e6. And f takes e6 has already been played in a couple of games. In particular, for instance, by Sergei Kudrin, who used to be a very established specialist in all things Grunfeld. And the point is, of course, that black is trying not to give the c4 pawn back at all. You don't really ruin your structure to such an extent if it doesn't at least preserve you the extra pawn you currently have. If queen b4, black can play b5, a4, c6. And this structure, although it looks extremely ugly, is very, very durable, and white will find it very hard to win that pawn back. Also, it's notable that the bishop is currently stuck on f1. If white could magically play bishop e2, f3 here, he'd be doing extremely well. But bishop e2 is almost always met by queen takes g2, so that is a move white somehow needs to prepare, wasting valuable tempi. White tried a number of things against f6. In practice, if you play e4, the queen goes to a5, and then black can play either b5 or queen a4, for instance. Queen b2, queen a4 is how the game between Alexander Golzin and Sergei Kudrin went in 2004. These are obviously very sharp positions. I would hesitate to volunteer an immediate opinion on who's better here. And Anish gave it some very, very serious thought, but eventually decided against it and took with the queen. And here, already Hikaru did something which I think is very clever and important in terms of theory in this line. There is a previous game which got to this position between Bartek Maciej and David Navarro in 05. And Bartek, as most people would do without thinking even, just played queen b5 check and queen takes c4. And black took on c4 and played knight d7, and a very similar endgame to the one which happened in the game between Hikaru and Anish appeared on the board. But by playing queen b4 instead, as you will see, Hikaru managed to win half a tempo. And this is not a particularly tempo-related endgame, but still, whenever you can win half a tempo for no cost, you should obviously do so. And the point is, White sort of asks black the question if he wants to allow white to keep the queens on by allowing bishop takes c4. If black goes knight c6 here, I think you probably go queen a4. And let's say castles, bishop takes c4, queen d6. This is a playable position for black. All of the positions you can get in this, starting from here, are not going to be horrible for black. But white will always preserve some sort of pressure because he has the bishop against the knight. And also there is this very important square a6, which means that your normal Grunfeld counterplay of just playing, let's say, a knight a5 followed by c5 is very inefficient here, because you basically never want to open the c-file when the bishop is on a6. Because you will just immediately lose the c-file to the rook on c1, since c8 is controlled by the bishop. This is a very important and a very typical structural thing you need to understand when you play the Grunfeld with black, that when your pawn is already on b6 and you don't have a bishop on b7, you probably want to go for different pawn breaks, and in particular, it might be wiser to go for e5 rather than c5 in these types of positions, because you play c5, but you more or less can never take on d4. And Anish, after some thought, decided that allowing white to keep the queens on is inadvisable, so he played queen d5, once again using the same theme, bishop takes c4, queen takes g2, and re-establishing the threat of b6, b5, so white takes on c4. And as I mentioned, this is exactly the same endgame that David Navarro got, but the pawn is on c7 and not on c6, and it is half a tempo, which might become useful in the future. e6, bishop e2, knight d7. There's not a lot to say about the following play, because the evaluation will always remain the same here. Objectively, white should not win from here. I think objectively this position must be okay in the way that black should hold and not lose. But white will always remain somewhat better, because bishop is just stronger than knight here, and also white has a slightly more mobile structure on the queen side, allowing him to go for a4, a5 expansions, or if black plays a5 himself, white will be able to go c4 and perhaps at some point go for the c4, c5 break. So it's not immediately obvious which structures black should be aiming for here. And white did go a4, king e7, Anish decided to allow e5, a5, c6. In a similar spot, David Navarro decided to just go for, I don't know if the same would have happened in this game, but David went to, took a very stark decision of even recapturing on b6 with the knight. And giving up, he played at some point rook a8 and rook c7 and replied to a6 with knight takes b6, and then played c6, c5. If we can just briefly have a look at that game, queen b5 check c6, takes, knight d7, a4 rook c8, bishop a6 rook c7, a5. Black finished his development. But then in this position he decided to not even recapture with the pawn, because that pawn would tie his knight on d7 constantly to the protection of If you take with a pawn here, you have to constantly worry about this pawn. So he took with a knight and then played c5 and eventually made a draw. But it also shows that equalizing here is not a given. And Anish decided not to wait for any of that to happen, because white obviously has a lot of moves here which improve his position. Bishop f3 is one obvious way to improve it. Also, you might consider doubling on the a file in some positions, or playing rook hb1 and then c4, aiming maybe to play c5 at an opportune moment. And Danish played b5, which is a committal decision, and I'm not sure if I can form a definitive opinion without some serious analysis, whether this is better or not compared to just waiting. But waiting is not something that comes very naturally to many chess players, and I can understand why Anish decided to start doing something. Rook b1, rook b8, rook b2, f5. Once again, white is just very slowly increasing his pressure against the b-pawn, planning to go rook hb1 and then probably play c3, c4 at the time where this will have the maximum effect. And for black, the question is, in particular, does he want to play a7, a6? You can play a6 at any point. White is not even trying to stop that. But the issue with a6 is that now once white does this, for instance, you make, I don't know, some natural looking moves, you are now extremely unhappy with the idea of taking on c4 ever, because these positions with the weakness on ac fixed on a6 will be very unpleasant for black. The same position with the pawn on a7 is probably just completely equal, because black snaps off one pair of rook on b2, puts another one on b8, and if white trades, black will eventually trade the c6 pawn for the d4 pawn, and the pawn on a7 is unreachable. It's way too far in black's camps for white to do anything. Whereas with the pawn on a6, you are now committed to trying to hold this line of defense. You will never really be able to take on c4. And white can now switch to trying to play along the c file. You go, let's say rook hd8, white will play something like, potentially something like rook bc1, followed by rook b2, c2, and then the threat of c takes b5, and rook 6 check will start looming very large. And Anish understandably decided that he plays b5, but he doesn't want to place yet another pawn on the light square. So a6 is not part of his setup here. He went f5, rook hb1, king d6. You could maybe make an argument for playing e5 instead earlier than he did, but I don't think it changes a great deal, because I'm not sure black wants to take on d4 anyway here. And white could make some waiting moves. But perhaps it's more about not putting the king on d6 than about playing e5. The king on d6 is potentially maybe getting in the way of some counterplay you could hope for once white does play c3, c4, because then you can maybe at least hope to play against the d4 pawn. But the game continued. King d6, f3, another useful waiting move, e5, c4. And this is an interesting point, because black can obviously take on c4 here, but white probably includes d takes e5 at this precise moment when black cannot recapture with the knight, because the rook on b8 is hanging, king takes e5, and even the simple bishop takes c4, because I don't think rook b7 is achieving very much, since you're not really creating much of a threat, although it also is perhaps worthy of attention. And after, let's say, king d6, you can take on c4 now, and you've established the rook on b7, making it harder compared to this position for black to swap all four rooks. But even this maybe is still somewhat playable for white. Even with all four rooks gone, you can maybe try playing f4 check at a good moment, and then king d3, e4, and hope that because there's still play on both flanks, you retain a modicum of pressure. Although, having said all that, I think rook b7 is a lot more precise. And because of that intermediate d takes e5 check, Anish decides to take on d4 first. And if white now takes on d4, we will just take on c4, and this has to be very close to complete equality, because after bishop takes c4, for instance, you can take on b2, and even if rook b8 right now is probably impossible because bishop g8 looks very strong, you can probably play something like king c7 followed by rook d8, knight f6, and black's position doesn't look horrible. And Hikaru takes an interesting and I think a very strong decision of taking on b5 here and making sure that there's a lot of space available for both his bishop and his rooks. And the position is now a lot more open. The structure has become completely symmetrical, but bishops are famously much stronger than knights in such structures where there's still play on both sides. And Jan, during the live broadcast, immediately got reminded when he saw this position of a very famous victory of Robert Fischer over Mark Taimanov in their famous 6-0 candidates match. Black played knight f6, bishop c4, takes, rook e8, king d4. This is not a particularly pleasant position to play. And once again, maybe there is some argument for trying to create some activity, playing rook e1, rook d1 check, and only returning to e7 once you've driven the king away from the center. But it doesn't really feel all that critical anyway. And at this point, we felt that, of course, white remains. It will be white who is driving the action, but it should be holdable in this position. Anish played rook e7, rook b8, rook d7, rook c8, winning as much space as possible, rook b7, a6. And we enter sort of the next phase of the game, where white has extended as much as possible, created this weakness on a7 he is hoping to play against, but proving this is enough will not be a trivial task at all. And for a while, I think Anish defended very resourcefully. Rook b4, king c3, rook a4, king b3, knight d7, a very nice tactical detail using the knight's forking abilities to its fullest. Bishop b5, rook a5, king b4, rook a1. It seems like black is in a lot of trouble tactically, but the checks from the first are very effective here. After a couple of repetitions, I guess Hikaru wanted to check if bishop a4 wins, but here black can just play king e6. And the pawn endgame here might even be better for black, because it looks like after king b5, king d6, white will eventually lose the a6 pawn. Therefore, king b4, here the time control was reached, which is somewhat relevant. The position was repeated a couple more times, and then the king went back to the d file. The rook has to go back to c7 and king d4. And we've sort of re-established the previous setup, king e7. When I first saw this position, we were looking at something else during the height of time trouble, so we missed all that sequence when commenting live. My first instinct was that even the pawn ending after you take everything and establish the opposition might be dangerous for black. But here you're just not fast enough. You can start pushing on the king side, but if you actually run towards the h7 pawn, black runs towards the a pawn, and the a7 pawn queens, I think, a lot faster than whatever it is that white can achieve on the other side of the board. And both players came to the same conclusion, because after some thought, Anish played king e7, and Hikaru immediately replied by rook a8, king d6, h4, and we come to what probably is the most important position of the entire game, and the one where black was somewhat careless. This is not an easy position to play by any means, but his next move allowed white to improve his situation drastically. He should have gone for something like knight b6 or knight f6. A possible line after knight b6 is, let's say, check, king e6, rook b8, king d6, and white can maybe even try playing rook b7. But black is not really obliged to react. Taking and allowing bishop c6 looks risky, because your knight on b6 really doesn't have any moves, and then white can start running towards the h-pawns. But after rook b7, perhaps black can just play knight d5 and pretend that nothing much really happened yet. But Anish, perhaps feeling that even allowing the rook to get to b8 and b7 something he wants to avoid, kept the knight on d7 and played king e7. And this, we didn't spot it immediately, but this allows for a very important technical decision from Hikaru, because normally I've been stressing this point that the bishop in endgames on both flanks is a lot stronger than the knight. But here the deciding factor really is not the bishop, but the comparative activity of the kings. White takes on d7, rook takes, and king e5. And from here, black is in a lot of trouble. And what followed was, I think, a fairly exemplary conversion from Hikaru. After some thought, I think Anish found what is probably the best defense available: king f7, rook b8, rook e7 check, king d5, king f6. You need to establish the rook on the a file. For instance, if you go rook a2 and then take on g2, yeah, this is just very, very bad for black, because the king will run towards the a pawn here. Feels like white should be winning this. So he goes king f6, rook b7, rook e5 check, king d4, rook a5, rook a7. And here, perhaps it was more resilient not to push f4, but it does feel like with this setup, white is just fast enough. He will have to give up one of his kingside pawns, but he should still win after that. And the game concluded very swiftly, because both players, I think Anish by this point was very committed to the exact plan that he executed, and Hikaru was also pretty clear in his mind as to what he should be aiming for. Anish played f4, king c4 and rook a2, and Hikaru just proceeded with his original plan, king c5. You could maybe start giving checks here. I don't know what king c5 achieves before rook a8. But Anish played h5, and now after rook a8, the following sequence is almost forced. Check, king b6, check, king c5, just to get to move 60. Check, king b6, check, and finally king a7, rook g2, and rook b8. And here, black is just not fast enough, because the plan of establishing a bridge and then going king b7, a7, and either winning the rook, or in some lines even queening the a pawn for nothing, is just way too fast. For instance, g5, rook b6 check, king f7. Most moves probably win here, but the most efficient way to do it is just to play king b7, followed by a7 and rook a6, and the game is just completely over. Anish played rook f2, but here as well, white's win is very, very trivial. a7, rook a3, rook a6, rook b3, and king c6. And black has to resign, because his counterplay on the king side is nowhere near fast enough here. And a very nice, I think, technical game from Hikaru Nakamura, from a position where I think originally he did not have very much, but he continued increasing pressure on Anish, and at some point Anish did make a mistake which was large enough to finally let white in, and from that moment on Hikaru was completely relentless. So Hikaru is the early leader of the Stavanger Altibox Norway Chess 2017. He is the only one on +1. Anish starts with a loss. The other 4 games were drawn. But already in the first round there was a number of very interesting skirmishes, so that bodes well for the remainder of the tournament. Make sure to continue watching us on chess24.com, and on this note I will finish this wrap-up of round 1. See you tomorrow.